the question I posed for us is Corona and economic recovery, do we really want to return to normal? Well, most of us, the answer is obvious, right? We're tired of this, and we're concerned about the economy. We're concerned about our livelihoods. I know I am. And so for many of us, the answer is clearly we want to get the economy going again. We want to get back to normal. And if you have a concern for the poor around the world, there's much that should make you want to get back to normal as well. I like economic growth. One of my specialties is what makes for economic growth. And one of the reasons I like economic growth so much is that it's the primary strategy for reducing poverty in the world. Many of us don't realize, but that over the course of the past 25, 30 years, the percentage of people living in poverty around the world has actually plummeted. And so as this diagram shows us, the percentage of people living under $1.90 a day, that's kind of the global poverty line, has dropped from just above 35, 36% down to just about 10, 11%. It's an amazing accomplishment, and I don't want us to gloss over that. It's an amazing thing that's happened, and it's primarily the result of the spread of markets, the spread of Western-style capitalism to the rest of the world. It turns out that Western-style capitalism is really good at producing things, and it's really good at economic growth, and economic growth creates jobs, and those jobs provide the opportunity for people who are poor to get above the poverty line. And so I don't want us to lose sight of that. That's a really important story. And so for me, as one who focuses on poverty, I'm eager for the economy to return, not just to the United States, but globally, of course, so that we can continue to promote the kinds of economic environments that enable poor people to flourish, to get out of poverty. Some economists believe that should economic growth continue, and this is before the virus hit, but should economic growth continue, the spread of markets continue, the belief is that we could actually eradicate absolute material poverty over the course of the next 20 to 30 years. And so there's a sense in which we do want things to return to normal. But I also have some questions about the nature of economic growth and the nature of Western economics and the way that in what we're spreading to the world through the process of globalization. Here's a diagram that just shows us real income per person. So it's an average kind of figure, income per person in the United States from 1972 to about 2008. And as you can see there, real income per capita continued to grow. But then there's this red line, which is the self-reported happiness of Americans. Now, this is a very subjective kind of thing. They literally go to Americans and say, kind of on a scale of 1 to 5, how happy are you? And so it's very subjective. But what you'll notice here is that in spite of the fact that incomes had steadily been increasing, the self-reported happiness of the average American was actually constant. And for an economist, this is like an impossibility that income would go up, that consumption would go up, and that our happiness would stay the same. And we're going to come back to this a lot in this talk. More recent data suggests that happiness has actually been declining in the United States, even before the virus hit. From 2006 to 2016, we see a pretty steady decline in happiness. Now, as I mentioned, happiness is a pretty subjective kind of thing. And so I look kind of for some more objective measures. And here's one that I think is very important, and that's mental health. Our beings kind of express what's really happening to us. And what's really crazy to me is that from 1938 to 2007, that's as far as this particular study went, we see actual steady increases in anxiety and depression amongst American young people. This in particular is college-age students. So this is not a recent phenomenon. This goes back to the 1930s. And so we've got this strange thing going on that we see ever-increasing levels of income and material prosperity. And yet there's something in ourselves, there's something in our personhoods that's screaming out and saying, I'm not made for this. I'm wired for something different. There's something that doesn't fit here, that doesn't really support who I am as a human being. And so this really bothers me. How can we have increasing income and wealth and constant increases in anxiety and depression. And do we actually want to return to this? Is that the goal, that we want to return to a world that looks like this? And it's a world that we're spreading from the West around the entire globe. You know, it's interesting. Economists, again, we tend to believe that more income leads to more happiness. But I love the title of this book. It's written by an economist, and it's called Happiness Around the World: The Paradox of Happy Peasants and Miserable Millionaires. Because as we look at data around the world, it appears that as people's incomes go up, their self-reported happiness often doesn't go up and sometimes even declines. There's another publication, I guess my slide didn't quite make it there. This raises the question of, what is human flourishing? What does human flourishing really look like? And are we moving towards that or not? Are we moving towards greater flourishing? Is that the direction we're heading? And do we want to return to that? So I want to ask those two questions. Let's start with the first one. What is flourishing? What does it look like? Well, I'm going to speak from my own faith tradition. And I am a follower of Jesus Christ, and so I want to speak from a biblical perspective and very quickly try to answer the question, how does the Bible describe what human flourishing looks like? Well, the Bible starts, of course, with God. It doesn't start with human beings. It starts with God. And one of the central ideas of the Christian faith is that God is three in one, that there's this thing called the Trinity, right? So there's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that God is three persons in one Godhead. And what that means is that God is inherently a relational being. From all eternity, the three persons of the Trinity have existed in deep relationship with one another. And at the heart of that relationship is love, that God is inherently a loving being. And out of the overflow of God's love, he creates a world. And so he is a relational God who creates the world out of his love, and he continues to relate to it. Again, relationship is inherent to the very being and character of God. And so God is constantly relating to his world. Colossians chapter 1 actually teaches that Jesus Christ is the creator and sustainer of the entire cosmos. He's actively present. He makes the sun go up and go down every night. Gravity isn't just suspended out there on its own. The hand of God actually holds gravity in place. God is inherently a relational being. He makes human beings in his image. The Bible teaches us that human beings are physical creatures. We are physical, but we're also spiritual creatures. We have a soul. And theologians have tried to unpack what the soul looks like. And the scriptures seem to suggest that the soul has three aspects to it: the mind, our cognitive ability; our affections, kind of like our emotions that drive us; and then our will, our desire to act. And so these aren't separate components, but more like three different facets of the human soul, of our inner beings. Now, what's really important, these slides take me a long time to create, and I see I messed one up earlier, but the next slide is really important, so pay attention, because it's counter to how most of us think of what a human being is. What the Bible suggests is that the human being is a highly integrated body and soul. And so we're like this. We're beings that are integrally physical and spiritual in nature. And they're so integrally intertwined that it's actually difficult to separate out the body and the soul. What's happening to us physically affects us spiritually. What's happening to us spiritually affects us physically. And there's more. Some in our audience are probably pretty comfortable with this, but there's one more feature to the human being that many of us in the West are blind to. I know it's not been my primary strength. God is inherently a relational being, and he's wired human beings for relationship as well. We're not sort of these autonomous body soul creatures as pictured here. We're deeply created for community and for relationship. We are not just bodies, and we're not just bodies and souls. We're body, soul, relational things. And I try to figure out how to capture this. The Bible suggests there's four key relationships for each of us: a relationship with God, with ourselves, with others, and with the rest of creation. Four key relationships. We're wired for intimacy with God. We're wired to see ourselves as beings with inherent dignity and worth. We're wired for deep community with others. Many of us are experiencing frustrations right now because we're experiencing social isolation. That social isolation that's painful is reflective of our deep wiring for community. And again, a relationship with the rest of creation, that's fundamentally about preserving and protecting the created order, but also unfolding it and unpacking it through our work. Work is not a necessary evil. Work is good. It's inherent to who we are as image bearers. And then there's a rhythm of rest as well that's built into the human condition. So I'm trying to figure out, how can I picture this thing? And so this is the best I can come up with. The human being is wired to be like a tire. Okay, so the human flourishing is this. We are designed to be highly integrated mind, affections, will, body, relational things. We are deeply wired to be this thing. And so the boundary of the human being, if you will, is not the hub in the middle. The boundary of the human being is actually the outer edge of the tire. What's happening to us relationally actually affects us physically and spiritually. This is why there's so much, one of our concerns about people not working, of course, is that they won't have enough to eat. But it's more than that, isn't it? Because imagine what happens if one of the spokes in a tire is removed. So just imagine for a second, if you take out one of these spokes and the tire goes down the road, what's going to happen? Well, the whole tire is going to become warped. All the spokes are going to become bent, and the hub and each part of the hub is going to be distorted. And so any part of the tire that's out of whack reverberates to the whole thing. And so if we're not working, if our relationship to creation is removed, what happens is all of our relationships are affected. Our self-image goes in the tank. We start screaming at our spouses. We start to have psychological problems. Our inner beings get screwed up. And so it's not that the inability to work isn't just a problem because we can't pay the bills. It's that, but it's more than that. It affects our entire personhoods. And there's plenty of research that suggests that this is true. In fact, there's a whole field that's burst forth called the science of happiness. It's sometimes called the field of positive psychology. It's a related field. And there's all these social scientists out there and people in natural sciences trying to figure out right now, what does human flourishing look like? And here's just one example. This is a book by a social psychologist at New York University named Jonathan Haidt, who's getting a lot of press the past 5 or 10 years. And he has this book called The Happiness Hypothesis. And he's not coming at it from a Christian perspective, but he actually looks at all of the research in the field of kind of social psychology, and he concludes the following. The human being is deeply wired for relationship with ourselves, with others, with work. And then he goes on to say, and with what some people would call a higher power or a God. He said, research suggests that happiness consists of enjoying these relationships in a particular way. Another example, there's something called the World Happiness Report, which has been produced in the past number of years. And it's actually written by the lead author on it. There's a team of authors, but the lead author on it is Jeffrey Sachs, one of the leading economists in the world, who's best known for his book, The End of Poverty. And Sachs has moved away from a purely material understanding of human flourishing to say human flourishing is multifaceted, it's multidimensional. And if you look at most of their research, it's along the lines of human beings are wired for relationship with themselves, with others, with work, and with a higher power. And so there's a lot of sort of social science and natural science research right now that's consistent with the biblical narrative. Well, are we moving towards greater flourishing? So if we accept the idea that human flourishing is about living in right relationship with God, with ourselves, with others, and with the rest of creation, are we moving towards that? What's the direction in which human beings are moving? Are we achieving greater levels of human flourishing? Well, it's interesting because the Bible actually suggests that human beings are not static creatures. We are dynamic creatures, and we're actually moving in the direction of whatever we're worshiping. And so by worship here, we don't mean just like, who do you sing a song to in church on Sunday morning? We mean more like, what's the biggest pull on your life? What's the magnet that's drawing you in? That thing that you're orienting your life around, that's what you're worshiping. And it turns out the human being actually is wired to take on the qualities or characteristics of that thing that we're worshiping. And so if you want to know the direction that an individual or that a culture is moving in, ask, what is the direction, or I should rephrase that, what is that individual or culture worshiping? What is the orientation? What is the magnet that drives the people in that culture? And that will tell you something about what we're becoming. And the process that theologians and philosophers believe that makes that kind of story work, that we become what we're worshiping, looks something like this. That a community, every community, think of this oval here as a community, every community's God, so to speak, gives it a story of change, a story about what is the good life and how is that good life achieved. And the community tries to live out that story by engaging in formative practices, practices that help the members of the community to achieve the story of the community, to achieve the community's goals according to the community's way of achieving those goals. And those practices shape us. They make us into different kinds of creatures. And those practices then get embedded into systems, the formal and informal institutions of the community. And over time, the story, the practices, and the systems actually shape the individual personhoods of the members of that community so that they become the kinds of creatures that help the community to achieve its goals, to achieve its worship. Let me give you an example. Think of this community as being a basketball team. The story of change of a basketball team is the goal is to win the game by scoring the most points. The practices are what you do every night. You practice passing and you practice dribbling and shooting and elbowing the guy in the nose when the ref isn't looking. And the coach embeds that story in the systems the coach creates. And so those who help the team win get more playing time. They get the most valuable player award, and they get lots of praise. And those who don't do very well get put at the end of the bench. And so the coach creates a system that reinforces the story of winning by scoring the most points. And over time, this actually enculturates, it changes the people on the team so they become more effective players. They become the kinds of creatures that when you pass them the ball, and there's a second left in the game, they automatically respond and shoot the ball in the basket, win the game. The cultures and the stories we live into change who we are, making us more into the story of the God that we are worshiping. So think about that. And now think of the alternative stories to the biblical story. The primary story shaping Western civilization, the primary story shaping Western economics, the primary story that the Western society is exporting to the world through the process of globalization looks like this. There is no God, or if he exists, he's not relevant. The world, the cosmos, is fundamentally material in nature, and corresponding to that, the view is that the human being is fundamentally material in nature. Instead of being this highly integrated mind, affections, will, body, relational things, the human being in Western naturalism is an autonomous, self-centered, highly materialistic creature. My discipline of economics has this at the center. Because there's no God, the goal of economics is to worship this God, to make this God happier. In economics, this conception of a human being is called Homo economicus. It's a self-centered, highly materialistic creature that gets happiness from greater consumption. So the goal in the story is to create an economic system that enables this creature to earn more income so that this creature can buy more stuff, because more stuff is the goal. And so it looks something like this. The story of change is more consumption through growth. The way of achieving this is through education, hard work, and consumption. We create systems for growth and consumption. We create these within the city of Dallas. We create them in the state of Texas. We create them nationally and globally. We've created an economic system that promotes growth. It does. Tremendous engine for growth. But in the process, I fear that what it's doing is shaping us into this self-centered, highly individualistic, highly materialistic creature called Homo economicus. And folks, we're not wired for that. There's plenty of research going on right now that says if you want to have mental illness in your society, put people into a system that makes them highly individualistic and highly materialistic. This is not what we're wired for, and our personhoods are screaming out against this and saying, I'm not created to be Homo economicus. I'm created to be a body-soul relational thing. And the culture, the economy I'm part of is trying to squeeze me like a square peg into a round hole. I don't fit that. And our personhoods are screaming out against this. Unfortunately, I believe the story of the Western church, of Western evangelicalism in particular, is also flawed. And the story of Western, I know I'm short on time, but the story of Western Christianity, in particular Western evangelical, goes like this. There is a God, but this God is largely the Lord of our spiritual lives, and he's divorced from the physical, or sometimes we might call it the secular realm. So God is the one that we worship on Sunday morning, but Monday through Saturday, this God is largely detached from our daily existence. It's a God that's spiritual, that has no interest in the things of this life, in the things of this world. It's not a God who cares about our bodies. It's not a God who cares about the earth. It's not a God who cares about the Green Bay Packers, who are definitely God's team. We've thrown off our coach to the Dallas Cowboys. Good luck. It's not a God who cares about any of that. It's a God who's only concerned about the spiritual realm. And corresponding to that, we've conceived of the human being as largely a body that contains a soul, but the soul and the body are separable, and the soul has been reduced to the mind. It's not an integrated body-soul relational creature. It's a body that contains a soul. The soul is solely the mind. And the goal in this story is to get the soul to heaven for all eternity. It's not a story of concern for this world. It's not a story of concern for the whole person. It's a story of get our souls beamed up to float around like ghosts for all eternity. It's not a story for this life. And so what happens is we don't have a story to guide us Monday through Saturday. So most of us in the Western church simply revert to the story of the American dream, like the rest of the surrounding culture, because we don't have a story. And so what we do is we live the American dream right now for our bodies, along with the rest of the globe, and we hope that our souls will go to heaven someday. And what that does is it results in this. I teach at a Christian college. Great students, godly young people from great Christian families. But what we see amongst our students is they look a lot like the culture around them. They come in increasingly with tremendous amounts of mental illness and struggles because they too are living into this story of Western naturalism and the American dream Monday through Saturday. So I would submit to you folks that there's three views of human flourishing out there in the West. There's Western naturalism, there's Western evangelicalism, and there's a biblical framework, which is far more holistic, which is far more rooted in community, which has to do with deep relationship. We've got to start to live into that story. And so I don't actually want the economy to return to what it was before. I'm looking for a different economy. I'm looking for an economy that's consistent with the human flourishing on the right. And I don't completely know what that looks like, because I've only experienced the kinds of economies that we've created so far. But we need a different kind of economy, an economy that's about relationship, stewardship, mutual responsibility, care, community, not rugged individualism, not self-centered materialism. So I view this as a moment for us to pause. And I don't know what God is doing, but I can't help wonder. That a loving God who knows what human flourishing looks like, a loving God who wants the best for his creatures, might be giving us all one big pause from the lies that are woven into the global economy to say, folks, there's a better way. And we've got to start moving towards that better way. I'll stop now and take whatever questions I can field in the amount of time we've got. And I'm supposed to know how to do something here. Here we go. Go to the chat thing. The first question is, what is your greatest hope that can come from this COVID crisis? For me, the greatest hope is that we would actually really stop and reflect on what is human flourishing, and that we would press into that. And we wouldn't just all say, how can we get back to what we were doing before? Because I don't think it's working that well. And we'd actually stop and reflect on what does human flourishing really look like, and how can we start to live into that story more effectively. I'm trying to take notes. By the way, I am guilty of everything I'm talking about right now. I'm working like a dog right now. That the virus is wreaked havoc with the organizations that I'm affiliated with, and we're trying to make it work. And I'm working like crazy. But I'm also trying to pause and ask, what's better in this moment? Is there something better that I'm seeing in my life or in the communities around me that we can hold on to and preserve once the virus has ended? And for me, it has to do with the story I've been trying to talk about already. This question is, what do you think is responsible for the decline of mental health? Why do we see anxiety, depression, addiction, et cetera, on the rise? Yeah, there's a lot of research going on right now about this, and I'm particularly appreciative of the work of a social psychologist named Jean Twenge, Twenge. In fact, one of the diagrams I showed you comes from her. She's not the only one, but she's doing a lot of research on this, and her argument is that it's actually our pursuit of the American dream that's causing the anxiety and depression. We are not made to be individualistic, self-centered, materialistic creatures. We're not wired for that. We're wired for a different kind of thing. And that our pursuit of that story, that false story, is actually deforming us. It's taking us from whole tires, stripping us down to the bare hub, and our bodies are screaming out. And so I actually think it's the pursuit of the American dream in the form of Western style capitalism right now that's killing us. And as I say that, I realize I'm talking to a bunch of people in Dallas, Texas, who are heavily involved probably in finance. I'm an economist. I started this workshop off saying I love growth. Growth has done some amazing things. It's the primary cause of reductions in material poverty. I don't like big government. I'm to the right of center. So what I'm arguing right now is not for some kind of adoption of some kind of centralized planning or government. That doesn't work. We've got to find a different form of capitalism. We've got to find a different way of doing this thing that fosters community, that fosters relationship, that fosters saying enough is enough. And I don't know what that looks like, but that's where I think we've got to go. What practices specifically do you anticipate will be changed forever as we recover from this crisis? I'll be honest with you, I'm so conflicted. I want the crisis to end today. I'm nervous about my job. I'm nervous about the college I'm part of. I'm nervous about the Chalmers Center. I'm nervous about everything. My primary spiritual gift is anxiety. And so part of me is like, let's get back to work today. But also my biggest fear is that we're all going to recover too quickly and we're not going to learn any lessons. And so what practices do we anticipate will be changed forever? If the virus ends too soon, none. If the virus lasts, I hope that what will be changed is that we will rediscover community, that will rediscover spiritual practices, that will rediscover relationship. And my fear is that the virus will end too soon before we rediscover that. And as I say that, I have relatives who have the virus. I want this thing crushed, believe me. But I'm afraid we're we're not going to get the lessons we need here. Why do you measure happiness instead of joy? I feel like we often hear about the difference between the two in Christian circles. Yeah, so this is a great question, and you should take the happiness measures very lightly. I'm drawing on the kind of the research that's taking place right now in a number of the social sciences, and just to say there's a whole field out there that is working on this. I've got on my desk in my office at work, I've got the Oxford Handbook on Happiness, and it's this thick, and it summarizes all the research on happiness. And so I simply mention that because it's the measure that's being used. I don't think it's the right measure. I think joy is a better one. I think communion. If you talk to theologians, what are these relationships supposed to look like with God, self, others, and the rest of creation? It has to do with the idea of communion, and I'm still trying to figure out what that means. But it's a giving and receiving. It's a mutuality. It's a care. It's a pouring out oneself on behalf of the other. It's a different kind of thing, and so. Happiness isn't really the right measure. It's not the right term. What does this pandemic reveal about what we worship as a nation? Will that change? I think that's a spectacular question. I haven't shared this with anybody publicly. I'm just going to try this out with you folks, but there is research, again, from mainstream social scientists that says the following: we're deeply wired for relationship. That's where flourishing comes from. And what happens is, as our relationships are disintegrating, we essentially try to cover the pain through more and more material prosperity. And so there's a sense in which our consumerism kind of deadens the pain of the loss of relationship. And so we don't notice it. We don't notice how much pain we're actually in, because there's like an anesthesia over it. And so, yeah, my marriage is breaking down, but I can go shopping this weekend. Or I don't have any friends, but I can go downhill skiing. And so we kind of deaden the pain with consumerism. And I want to be careful with this. I don't like it when people say this is what God is doing. God is acting this way because we don't know what God is doing. And so you should take this with a grain of salt. I don't know. But it's crossed my mind that if I were a loving God, and I really wanted people to get what's going on, I might say to them, I'm going to take away the anesthesia that's covering your pain. I'm going to shut down the entire global economy to take away the balm, the false balm that you're using. And I'm going to send you all home where you've got social isolation. And I want you to see what social isolation, which is where you're heading as a people, I want you to see what that looks like. And I'm going to take away the balm so you can feel that a little bit. I don't know. I wonder, and it makes me wonder if what God is asking us to do is to recognize that the self-centered materialism is not the right way to go, and we've got to get back to relationship. Somebody asked, what other author researchers are you reading the space of happiness and human flourishing? I forgot to mention, I forgot to mention, everything I'm talking about right now comes from a book that I recently co-authored, Becoming Whole, Why the Opposite of Poverty Isn't the American Dream. Becoming Whole, Why the Opposite of Poverty Isn't the American Dream. There's a corresponding book called The Field Guide to Becoming Whole. And so if you look in there, you'll see a bunch of the research in the endnotes and footnotes. But there's a whole field. It's called the economics of happiness. There's another one called the positive psychology. There's if you just Google those two things, a host of resources are going to come up The most popular course at Yale University right now is a course on happiness. Everybody is into this right now. That having been said, the primary informer for me on this isn't the social sciences or natural sciences, it's God's word. I co-authored Becoming Whole with a Trinitarian theologian named Kelly Kapic, who, as a Trinitarian theologian, has spent a lot of time working on biblical anthropology. And so what I'm really doing here is trying to tap into what does the Bible say? What does the Church of all ages taught? And then kind of augmenting that with, oh, hey, there's research, contemporary research that supports what we're saying here. But the reality of it is, I just think this is what the Bible's teaching. And it doesn't really matter to me as much what the social sciences are saying. I think this is what the Bible is teaching. It is interesting to me that the social sciences and natural sciences are stumbling across the same thing, because I think it's true. Okay, next question. Can you talk about this? Oh, it just moved on me. Can you talk about the shift to virtual relationships, i.e. Zoom like this one, and increased dependence on social media, and how you might see that change us for the better or worse in the years to come? Yeah, so I'm trying to teach principles of macroeconomics online right now to 50 students scattered all over North America. It's not that great. So on the one hand, I think that virtual communication is a gift that we can use. The Chalmers Center that I work with is trying to figure out additional ways to use online learning, virtual communication. I think it's a tool to use, but it just doesn't substitute for in-person. We are embodied creatures. Research suggests a tremendous amount of what we communicate actually is from body language that's picked up by other people's bodies in the room. And so the idea that we're just sort of information that's hurled out there, it just isn't true. I wish it were, because it's a lot more efficient, but it doesn't, there are things it can do for us, but ultimately it's about people in community and relationship, and that includes physical relationship. You know, there's a major financial supporter of the Chalmers Center, and I was with him at a conference at Yale University about 2 years ago. It was all this very sophisticated research, and I looked at this financial supporter and I said, "What do you think?" He said, "I don't care about all this." He said, "I've been funding poverty alleviation around the world, and basically this is what poverty alleviation comes down to: God plus people plus time. Get people in community. God dwells amongst them, and over time, good things happen." And it's a little more complicated than that, but that's pretty close to what we're saying in our book, Becoming Whole. It's God plus people plus time. You can't substitute that virtually. Somebody has asked, understand that work was given before the fall and is good. How are Christian believers supposed to respond at a time when most fields of work are prohibited? What will the longer impact be on all of us spiritually? Oh, my word. Terrific question. Yeah, we're wired for work. And I think we have to, so I don't want to get into what President Trump is doing right or wrong, what his motivations are. But, when President Trump says, if we don't get back to work, we're going to start to see explosions of suicides and depressions and so on. I think he's correct about that. Now, again, I have concerns about the nature of the economy we've created here, but he is correct. You remove that smoke from work, there's all kinds of evidence that things go south. Sorry, I'm from the north. That things go the wrong direction quickly. I also think we need to recover work that's outside of the standard marketplace. There's ways of being productive and ways of working that aren't for pay. Now, of course, we all have to feed ourselves, but I think a lot of us have lost sight of the fact that there's other spheres, other mediums, if you will, other arenas, that's the word I'm looking for, in which we can be productive and work, even if it's not in a for-pay marketplace setting. And I think we've got to recover some of that as well. This person asks, what have you implemented in your own life to move away from Western evangelical to biblical Christianity? Leave me alone. In our book, I changed the language here a little bit for today, but in our book, Becoming Whole, we actually call what I called Western evangelicalism. Here in our book, we call it evangelical Gnosticism. Gnosticism, is this ancient heresy that says the body and the soul are separate. The soul is good and the body is bad. What have I done in my own life? First of all, I stink at this. The staff at the Chalmers Center laugh at me. They call me Dr. Relationship because I'm good at the theory of it. I'm very bad at the practice of it. What have I tried to do? I really have tried the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, I guess, to really develop my spiritual practices more. I'm a doer. I'm very task oriented. I'm always producing something. I've really tried to learn how to commune with God more. And I'm not very good at it. I've tried to learn how to read God's word and to meditate on it more and to spend more time in prayer and just contemplation. And I will say that when I am doing that well, when I'm doing that consistently, again, the goal isn't my personal happiness, but I feel it. I feel joy. Somebody was mentioning earlier, I feel more joy. I feel more peace, more calm. I think my work becomes less arduous and less enslaving and more of a sense of offering and worship that has more joy in it. So for me, it's been a kind of a journey into I would say a more kind of contemplative set of practices rooted in God's word. Yeah. What is your response to fixing the mental health crisis? I'm worried about the mental health of our nation at this time, especially after research. What should our response as individuals in the church be moving forward? Yeah, again, work is good, but it's taking over. The story of Homo economicus is invading all aspects of our lives. And so, I love economic growth. I love economic exchange. When I'm overseas, I go to the marketplace just because I get a kick out of it. I like seeing people trade things. And for some reason, it makes me happy to see people selling vegetables and selling fruits. I like economic exchange. I actually believe it's part of the created order. But economic life ought to be driven by a sense of worship of God and of service to others, not out of a sense of self-centered materialism. And economic life should be bounded. It's only one of many spheres of life in which we are supposed to exercise responsible stewardship, in which we're supposed to be flourishing. We are supposed to be spouses and parents and involved in civic life and involved in the arts, involved in all kinds of things. And so I think part of what the church needs to do is help us push back at the ever-encroaching Homo economicus, both in terms of the narrative of our economic lives, but also in the percentage of our lives devoted to this. One of the primary ways the church can do this is through the recovery of Sabbath. I will be honest with you, I'm a workaholic by nature. There's all kinds of things in my DNA that contribute to that. I'm also a Dutch, and so in Dutch culture, you kind of work yourself into the ground. And so for the kind of the cultural setting I was raised in, being a workaholic is next to godliness. And it's always couched in the language of stewardship, right? And so Satan gets in there and twists that and has twisted that in my own life in ways that have been very detrimental. When I was in college, my older sister challenged me and she said, "Do you take Sabbath rest?" And I said, "Well, I go to church." She said, "No, you take Sabbath rest." And I, at that point, really committed myself to simply not studying on Sunday all the way through college, doctoral programs, not working on Sunday, bounding my life. And it's just simply non-negotiable. I just do Sabbath rest. It doesn't matter what the pressures are on Monday morning. I'm just going to take a day off. That boundary for me has been just... The effects of that in my life are off the charts. I literally think I would have lost my mind by now if it wasn't for that. I think we need more guardrails like that. We need more bumpers that bound us, that take Sabbath rest once a week, but maybe Sabbath, the Israelites every 7 years, the year of Jubilee. We're not doing a good job of Sabbathing. And so I could go off on that some more, but I got to stop here. Somebody just asked, can I say a word about Sabbath rest? That I just did. I wish I had more time to unpack the ways the Lord has used this in my life, and I would say ways that are miraculous, both in terms of providing me with rest, but also the ways that He's intervened in the Monday through Saturday part of my life, miraculously, in my view, to enable. He provides food, so to speak, metaphorically. He provides the manna miraculously when you do this, and He has done that for me, and so I'm very grateful for that. I think I've answered all the questions that are here. I think. I hope I don't see any more. Anyways, I'm worn out. I need a Sabbath rest. Philip, I'm going to turn it back over to you.